COVID-19 has brought a new sense of urgency to elder law planning, with seniors among those most at risk. I'm with Foster Swift attorneys Matt Fedor and Nick Camargo to talk about elder law planning today. First, Nick, I'd like to ask, what does elder law include?
That's a great question. Elder law is this area of law that's sort of developed over the last, I'd say 20, 30 years in earnest. And as we go through time, we find more and more facets to elder law. I get asked that quite often, what is elder law? And really, it's a broad spectrum of things that relates not only to Medicaid planning, which is what a lot of people think of, but to basically any issue relating to elderly populations or those with disabilities, really. That might include guardianships. It might include long-term housing planning. There's financial aspects to it. And truly, an elder law attorney not only works with the individual themselves or their families, but works with a lot of other professionals, healthcare providers, financial planners, to sort of set up overall goals and plans for those of us that are aging, so that we can sort of ease into our final years in a way that is, I think, able to make them at peace. And so generally it's all encompassing, if you will.
Matt, why is elder law planning so important?
Well, Julie, it's very important because it has to do a lot with the care of our loved ones. As they age in place, people call all the time with, how do I get assistance for my parent who's still living in their home? Or how do I protect them from scams and other financial predators out there, that we want to make sure that their assets aren't dissipated unnecessarily. So it's important from the standpoint of making sure that our parents and our grandparents are cared for and respected in the manner in which they deserve. So we definitely counsel clients on almost every, just from practical standpoints as well as legal. So Nick mentioned Medicaid, guardianships, conservatorships. There's that process with the courts and with the federal and state agencies. But there's also the humanistic side of it, which is us caring for our family members and how to best accomplish that. So it really is, it's as important to the younger generation who's now caring for the elderly population as it is for the elderly.
You mentioned assets, of course. What happens to my assets if there isn't a plan in place?
Well, I'll just start off. That's usually when people come and say, hey, my parent has to enter into a nursing facility. How can we pay for this? And Julie, there's really two ways to pay for it. There's private pay, in which someone pays the bills every month as they come due, or there's Medicaid, which is the program for people who don't have the funds and resources to pay for their private pay care. And those are the two main sources. There's long-term care insurance, and there's some other options to help supplement against the bills, but effectively it's those two. It's private pay or Medicaid. And private pay is obviously what it sounds like. People save their money for their whole lifetime, for their retirement, and then when it comes time to retire or go into a nursing facility, they spend down that money for as long as they can to pay for the care. And care in Michigan, ranges on average from $7,000 to $9,000 is what we've been seeing, all in on a monthly basis. So an individual with $100,000 in savings, could get approximately a year out of that before they don't have any resources left. So Medicaid is an opportunity to kind of step in, and with proper planning, you can preserve the bulk of those savings and the private assets that the individual has, and request that the state pay through Medicaid. There's all kinds of requirements. It's fairly complicated in order to qualify for Medicaid, but it's effectively the converting of what they call countable assets to non-countable assets in order to preserve those assets. So it's really a situation where if you're concerned that your loved one, the elderly person, isn't going to be able to afford the expected time that they're going to be spending in the facility, then you need to contact an attorney to see what your options are.
If I can jump in, what Matt is discussing is one of the main issues in elder law planning, and that is how do we pay for our long-term care? But we also have to be mindful of the fact that elder law planning encompasses more than just Medicaid planning. And so when you ask a question such as, what happens to my assets if I don't plan? I think what Matt and I would probably tell you on the most basic level is, what happens to your assets is that they're handled in the least efficient manner possible. And leaves you in a situation where you are least able to preserve them for future generations, for legacies, and for your own well-being. So I think in an overall general view, planning is so important because it does all those things Matt talked about with long-term health plans. It also manages your assets for transfer of property in an efficient manner. It avoids probate if you're talking about the estate planning side of things. It can protect you from creditors. We've talked about or briefly mentioned elder abuse and scams and financial scams. So you want to make sure everything's sort of protected. And when I think of an elder law plan, I don't just think of one specific part, but I think of an all-encompassing plan that is designed to protect all parts of your life and all parts of your assets. And again, to go back to what I said earlier, if you don't have that in place, then in some ways you're sort of condemning your assets to the least efficient use or the most susceptible sort of dissolution of those assets.
Yeah, Nick brings up a couple good points there, Julie. Another question we get a lot is about how to care for a parent who's still at home. If they're not going into a facility, how can I still maintain my job and my family while still caring for the individual? So we have resources, and we've partnered with other agencies who provide in-home support. It's obviously there's a cost for that, but having a third party, making sure that it's a professional organization who's insured and doing the right background check on them to assist and give the caregivers a respite or bring them in on a regularly scheduled basis. Another thing we get asked a lot about is, my parents have a phone at home and there's people calling and they're spending their money and donating it, and how do I stop that? So there's a couple of different things we recommend typically in that situation, but it involves getting access to the individual's bank accounts. You don't necessarily have to become a signer or an owner. We don't recommend that, but you should have access. And with the online advantages today where you can look at accounts and see if there's any unregular activity in there or any odd transactions, it gives you the ability to monitor that so that you can help protect the individual's assets. If you see something that's funny, you can reach out and stop it. Those are just a couple examples of things that we recommend to clients, that aren't financially related necessarily or facility related. But as our parents age, these things become a concern. So whatever the situation is, we've seen a lot of different options and have made relationships with several different third parties that we can help recommend and help aid you in the caring for your adult who's staying at home.
When do we need to start planning? Nick, when does this process begin?
That's a really great question. And I'll tell you, the answer for me always is as soon as possible. And we're going to get into more of the specifics because not every estate or a portion of elder law planning, like Medicaid planning, might not be something you need to be thinking about when you're 45. But that doesn't mean that you can't start your overall end-of-life planning at that young age. In fact, I encourage most of my clients to start talking about their plans with their children once their children have come of age. I really am a firm believer that communication between parents and children is the key to ensuring an effective plan later in life. If you wait until your parent is suffering through some sort of issues or starting to show decline due to aging, or as a parent, if you wait until you notice that you're suffering issues or showing declining due to age, I think you've waited too long. I think it's really important when you ask, when do we start? When does this start? You start as soon as you can have a good conversation. And those conversations are oftentimes not all that comfortable. I mean, let's face it, people don't like necessarily talking about the end of days, if you will. But the reality is, the earlier you start, the more often you start, even if it isn't a full engrossed conversation, the more comfortable it will get, so that when you are or when you find yourself in a situation where you really need to have important discussions, you're already comfortable with that setting. So that's one part of it. I think Matt probably can talk to Medicaid planning and when you should start that. With estate planning and some of the other planning for retirement, gosh, I've been told my whole life you can't start planning for retirement early enough. So a lot of that's pretty similar with the elder law planning stuff. Get your estate plans in order, and then as time goes on and as those needs start to increase, then you can get a little bit more specific with Medicare applications or Medicaid applications, long-term housing and how we're going to deal with that. But certainly starting early is always important.
Especially in the situation of the earlier you start having the conversation, the better prepared you are. Insurance, for example, long-term care insurance I mentioned earlier is one tool that you may want to utilize, but the later you start, the more expensive it is. So having the conversations early about what to expect and how to set yourself up so that when the time does come, you're ready to implement those plans, it can't be more beneficial than starting early. Unfortunately, most of the people that come to us don't start early. They come in in a desperate time where there've already been a diagnosis of dementia or there's a guardianship in place already. And so what happens is that limits your options. The earlier you start, the more options you have. And so if you come to us in an emergency or a crisis situation, we can still help you, but the reality is it's going to be more expensive and your options are going to be limited. So I would concur with Nick 100% to start having that conversation as early as possible. Even when you go in and update your estate plan, that would be a great time to talk to your attorney about the things that you should be thinking about and putting in place early enough so that if or when that situation arises, you're ready to handle it.
Matt, you mentioned expenses, and I imagine that that's one thought that may hold people back from early planning. What should people anticipate as far as expensive? Is this an expensive process to start the planning?
It can be. I would say that in the beginning, if you start early enough, the costs, while not insignificant, will be much less if you wait. And I think that's the case with most things, where if you come to an attorney and prepare your estate plan or keep your estate plan updated and have that conversation on how to be ready, that is going to be a much lower cost than if you come to us and say, my parents have been in a facility, a rehab facility, and I just got a letter from Medicare saying that they're going to cut us off next Tuesday. Obviously, that's more of an emergency planning situation, and the cost can rise significantly. I'd say anywhere from 3 to 4 times the cost of if you pre-plan versus if you wait till the emergency planning.
When you have attorneys who specialize in elder law like we do, who have contacts with other professionals who deal with this area, it's a lot easier to have those conversations. For example, even just in estate planning with new, younger families, I already begin to get into their heads the idea that, hey, we're going to want to talk about these things as we move through life. And we're going to want to be more proactive with communicating with our children. And sometimes they give me some funny looks. Of course, we're talking about, they may be planning for their 2-year-old and 5-year-old, and they're like, wait a second, what are we talking about here? But it's, again, going back to that idea of making them comfortable with the idea that, hey, just like that 2-year-old or 5-year-old relies on you, someday you're going to rely on them. And the better we can equip them to help you, and the better we can equip you to help yourself towards the end of the life, the better off you're going to be. And I think that's where elder law attorneys have a very special sort of relationship with their clients and unique skill set to be able to manage all of those things that we've talked about today relating to elder law.
When you're talking about elder law, you really need someone with the experience and the ability to address a multitude of circumstances, not just draft a will or a trust or a power of attorney, but you need someone who understands the intricacies of the end of life issues that may arise and be able to counsel you on that.
For more information on elder law planning, head to Foster Swift's Elder Law blog at mielderlawblog.com.